Hi, Marching Mizzou. In this video, we're going to talk about anatomy and physiology for marching band. This video will cover muscle anatomy and physiology, including the sliding filament theory, followed by bone anatomy, tendons and ligaments, and joints. There are three main types of muscles in the human body. Here we have skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. Regardless of the type, the purpose of your muscles are to respond to stimuli with contraction. In this video, we'll mostly be going over skeletal muscle because skeletal muscle is completely voluntary, meaning if you have proper working muscles, you can control when and how they move. The fibers of skeletal muscle are striated, tubular, and multinucleated. As you can see in that type of cell diagram, we have multiple nuclei per strand of cell, as well as location, which is attached to the skeleton. It does not have to be attached to the skeleton in all cases, but most of the time that is what you'll see. As I said before, these muscles are voluntary, meaning you choose for the most part when you can move and relax them. These are the biggest muscles that have a part in marching band, and we will be covering them more intensely than the other two types of muscle. In smooth muscle, we see fibers that are non-striated, spindle-shaped, and uninucleated. As you can see in the types of cell diagram, each strand is non-striated, meaning it is not wrapped in those small stripes going around it, and there's only one nucleus per spindle. These muscles are involuntary, and they're working all the time. And you can find this smooth muscle in things like your intestines, which produces a motion called peristalsis to continue your digestion. And that's a good example because the smooth muscle will take place in organs where you do not control when they're moving and when they're not. Similarly, cardiac muscle is a fiber with striation and branches, and they're also uninucleated. These muscles are also involuntary, and they're only covering the walls of the heart. As you can see, the cardiac muscle type of cell diagram has one nucleus per strand, and we do see branches. These two involuntary muscles are things that your brain is controlling the movement of all the time and is not something that you can really change. Here we have a diagram of skeletal muscle. There are three main layers of skeletal muscle: the epimysium, perimysium, and the endomysium. To go over some of the terminology of these words, the prefix epi means on top of or over, the prefix peri means around or about, and the prefix endo means within or inner. So we have the epimysium on the outside of the muscle, the perimysium, which sort of separates those smaller muscles, and the endomysium, which will be internal in the muscle. The epimysium is the outer layer of tissue surrounding, and inside the epimysium there are bundles of muscle fibers called fascicles. Each of those bundles is wrapped in a layer called the perimysium. Inside those muscle fibers, there's a final layer called the endomysium, which surrounds the individual muscle fibers that make up a fascicle. Each individual muscle fiber is made up of myofibrils. Myofibrils contain two filaments, which are also called myofilaments, actin and myosin, which are protein molecules that work together to do the physical action of contracting and relaxing your muscles. Myosin is a thick filament that acts as a motor to convert energy from ATP into mechanical energy, which allows contraction to occur. Actin is a thin filament that gets pulled when myosin arms are used to contract that muscle. In this diagram, you can see how each muscle is made up of a large number of separate fibers. The thickest part of the muscle, on the sort of leftmost side of this diagram, is referred to as the belly. The thinner ends of the muscles taper off into tendons. Tendons, as we will get to later, are fibrous and are used to connect muscle to bone. In the sliding filament theory, there are a couple important points of anatomy we should retouch. First is a myofibril, which is the cylindrical organelle that runs the length of a muscle fiber and contains actin and myosin filaments. We also have a sarcomere, which is the functional unit of the myofibril, which is divided into I, A, and H bands. We also see actin, which is the thin contractile protein filament with the active binding sites, and myosin, which is the thick contractile protein filament with protrusions known as myosin heads. We also see two binding proteins, the first of which is tropomyosin, which is an actin binding protein that regulates muscle contraction, and troponin, which is 3 proteins that is attached to tropomyosin. To describe the process of muscular contraction, I will break the system down into 5 steps. The first of those is when a nerve impulse arrives at a neuromuscular junction. When that nerve impulse arrives, it will cause a release of a chemical called acetylcholine. The presence of acetylcholine will cause depolarization of a motor end plate, and acetylcholine will travel through the muscle through transverse tubules. As a result, calcium will be released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. In the presence of high concentration of calcium, the calcium molecule will bind to troponin, changing its shape and moving tropomyosin from the active site of the actin. The myosin filaments now attach to the actin and form a cross bridge, which enables muscle contraction. The third step is the breakdown of ATP, which releases energy and enables the myosin to pull the actin filaments inwards and shorten the muscle. This occurs along the entire length of every myofibril in the muscle cell. Fourth, the myosin will detach from the actin and the cross bridge is broken when the ATP molecule binds to the myosin head. When the ATP is broken, the myosin head can attach onto an actin binding site further along the actin filament and repeat what's called a power stroke. This repeated pulling of actin over the myosin is also known as the ratchet mechanism. Finally, we see the muscle fully contracted. This process of muscular contraction can last as long as there are adequate ATP and calcium stores. Once nerve impulses stop, calcium is pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the actin returns to its resting position, causing the muscle to again lengthen and be relaxed. As we see in the leftmost diagram above, the diagram shows a muscle when it is relaxed. The bands are wide, the myosin and actin filaments overlap, but not by very much. As a result, there are fewer cross bridges between actin and myosin, so the muscle strength is very low. In the middle diagram, we see partial muscle contraction, which is when myosin and actin overlap more. Therefore, there is more potential for cross bridges to form, and the zone in between them will shorten. Finally, on the right, we see a fully contracted muscle. There is lots of overlap between the actin and myosin because the thin actin filaments have overlapped. Now there is a reduced potential for cross bridges to form again. Therefore, there will be low force production from the muscle, and the muscle is as short as it can be. After this process is complete, the muscle will relax again and return to looking like the leftmost diagram, so the process can repeat when a new signal is sent through the neuromuscular junction. Moving on from muscle anatomy and physiology, let's begin to talk about bone. The bone is actually made up of 3 different types of living tissue. Those types are compact tissue, which is the hard outside tissue of a bone, the cancellous tissue, which is sponge-like tissue inside of the bone, and subchondral tissue, which is smooth tissue located at either end of the bone, covered with cartilage. Cartilage is a specialized connective tissue that is present in adults. It is also the tissue from which most bones develop in children. The tough and thin outer membrane covering the bones is called the periosteum. Beneath the hard outer shell, there are tunnels and canals through which blood and lymphatic vessels run to carry nourishment to your bones. Muscles, ligaments, and tendons may attach. Bones are classified by their shape as long, short, flat, and irregular. Primarily, they are referred to as long or short. There are 206 bones in the human skeleton, not including your teeth and sesamoid bones, which are small bones found within the cartilage. There are 80 axial bones, which include the head, face, hyoid, auditory, trunk, ribs, and sternal bones. And there are 126 appendicular bones, including your arms, shoulders, wrists, hands, legs, hips, ankles, and feet. Bones provide shape and support for your body, as well as protection for some of your organs. They also serve as a storage site for minerals and provide the medium marrow for development and storage of blood cells. The different types of bone cells include the following. We have osteoblasts, which are found within the bone, and the function is to make new bone tissue. There are osteoclasts, which are large cells formed in the bone marrow, and the function is to absorb and remove unwanted bone tissue. There are osteocytes found inside the bone, and the function is to maintain bone as a living tissue. And there are hematopoietic cells found in the bone marrow, the function is to produce new red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. Because of the complexities of a bone's function, between providing strength and support for the body, there are many disorders and diseases that can affect bones. In addition to that, we have to be careful as marching athletes to keep our bones in good shape, including proper nutrition and trying to avoid any sort of impact that might cause fractures and breaks. The average person might find themselves using the words tendons and ligaments interchangeably. This is an inaccuracy in the English vocabulary that I will specify here. A tendon is a fibrous connective tissue that attaches muscle to bone. Tendons also might attach muscles to structures such as the eye. A tendon will serve to move the bone or the entire structure when there is contraction initiated. A ligament is a fibrous connective tissue that attaches bone to other bone, and it usually serves to hold structures together and keep them stable. In this diagram below, we see that skeletal muscle being held to the bone by tendons, and alternatively, we see ligaments binding bone to bone in the structure of your hand. A joint is the part of a body where two or more bones meet to allow movement. Every bone in the body, except for the hyoid bone in your throat, meets up with at least one other bone, forming a joint. The shape of the joint depends on your function, and generally speaking, the more movement that is possible at a joint, the higher risk of injury for that joint is. This is because a greater range of motion reduces the strength of a joint. Joints are held together, as mentioned before, by bands of tough connective tissue called ligaments. Smooth cartilage prevents friction as bones move against one another, and in freely movable joints, the entire joint is enclosed inside a membrane filled with synovial fluid, which helps provide lubrication and extra cushioning on impact. Muscles, as said before, are attached to bones with tough bands of connective tissue called tendons. And where tendons lie close to bones, tiny sacs called bursae sit between the tendon and the bone to reduce friction. A bursae is also filled with synovial fluid. Joints can be described and named by how much movement they allow. The three broad classes of joints include immovable, slightly movable, and freely movable joints. In immovable joints, two or more bones are in close contact, but no movement can occur. For example, the bones in your skull. The joints of your skull are called sutures, and you cannot and should not move them. Slightly movable joints are two or more bones held together so tightly that only limited movement is allowed, such as the vertebrae in your spine. Freely movable joints, which make up the majority of the joints in your body, are this type. Motion is the purpose of a freely movable joint, and there are 6 types that most people should know. First is a ball and socket joint, where a rounded head of one bone sits within the cup of another, such as the hip or shoulder joint. Movement in all directions is allowed. Saddle joint permits movement back and forth and from side to side, but does not allow rotation, such as the joint at the base of your thumb. A hinge joint is when two bones open and close in one direction only, in a plane like a door, such as the knee or elbow joints. A condyloid joint permits movement without rotation, such as in the jaw or the finger. A pivot joint, where one bone swivels around a ring formed by another bone, is a joint between the first and second vertebrae in your neck. A gliding joint, also called a plane joint, is when smooth surfaces slip over one another, allowing limited movement, such as in your wrist joint. Generally, in terms of movement, a joint might slide one flat surface across another, like in your wrists and ankles, increase or decrease the angle between two bones, like in the long bones of your body in the arms and legs, and allow circular movement, such as ball and socket joints, like the rotation of a shoulder, and allow rotation without displacing bones, like your head as it turns from side to side and swivels on the vertebrae of your cervical spine. Thank you for finishing the anatomy and physiology video of the Marching Mizzou Health and Safety series. As one final reminder, the leadership team and directors would like to remind everyone to continue your work over the summer. Continue practicing, continue exercising. That way you can maintain your muscle strength and your muscle endurance so we can hit the ground running for Band 138. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you for the next video in our series.